There are moments in history that nobody planned, nobody announced, and nobody wrote down in any official record, and yet they happened, and the people who were there never forgot them. This is one of those moments. It was the spring of 1964. Chicago was a city that knew exactly where its lines were drawn. Not on any map you could buy at a gas station, not in any law book you could pull from a courthouse shelf, but in the air itself, in the way certain doors opened for certain people and stayed firmly shut for everyone else. The lines were in the sidewalks, in the neighborhoods, in the lunch counters, in the signs that hung in windows with a quiet authority that needed no explanation. Everyone understood them. Everyone was expected to obey them. Bruce Lee was 23 years old. He had arrived in the city 2 days earlier from Seattle, where he had been teaching martial arts out of a small school he had opened with almost no money and an almost unreasonable amount of conviction. He was not yet famous. He was not yet the man whose face would appear on posters in 20 countries, whose name would be spoken in the same breath as legends. He was a young man with a black bag, a crisp dark suit he had paid too much for, and an appointment the following morning with a promoter who was considering sponsoring a demonstration tour across the Midwest. His companion that evening was James Yim Lee, no relation despite the shared surname, a Chinese-American martial artist from Oakland who had become one of Bruce's closest friends and early collaborators. James was older, quieter, and had lived in America long enough to carry a particular kind of exhaustion that Bruce, despite his sharp intelligence, had not yet fully learned to recognize. They were hungry. It was past 7 in the evening, and they had been walking for 40 minutes through a neighborhood neither of them knew well, looking for somewhere to eat. James spotted the restaurant first. It was a solid brick building on the corner of a wide street, with warm light pressing against the glass from inside, and the unmistakable smell of something roasting drifting through the ventilation grate above the door. A handwritten card was taped to the lower corner of the window. 6 words. No decoration, no apology. We reserve the right to refuse service. James read it and kept walking. Bruce stopped. "Did you read that?" Bruce asked. "I read it," James said, without turning around. "What does it mean exactly?" James turned then, slowly, with the expression of a man preparing to explain something that should not require explanation. "It means what it says, Bruce. Let's find somewhere else." Bruce looked at the door for a long moment. The light inside was warm. The smell was extraordinary. And somewhere behind that door a decision had been made about who was welcome and who was not. A decision made without knowing anything about the people it excluded except the shape of their faces. He picked up his bag. "I think," Bruce said quietly, "that I'd like to eat here." James Yim Lee had survived things that left marks invisible to the naked eye. He had grown up in Oakland in the 1930s, the son of immigrants who had learned early that survival in America required a precise calibration of visibility, present enough to work, invisible enough to avoid trouble. He had watched his father remove his hat when speaking to white men who did not deserve the courtesy. He had watched his mother cross the street instinctively when certain groups of men appeared on the sidewalk ahead. These were not dramatic moments. They were Tuesday. They were the texture of an ordinary life lived inside boundaries that had never been formally agreed to and could never be formally contested. So, when Bruce Lee stopped in front of that restaurant door and said he wanted to eat there, James did not feel admiration. Not immediately. What he felt first was the specific, bone-deep fatigue of a man who has already paid a price that his younger companion has not yet been asked to pay. "Bruce," he said, keeping his voice low and even, "I need you to understand something. This is not Hong Kong. This is not Seattle. This is a particular kind of neighborhood in a particular kind of city, and that card in the window is not a suggestion." Bruce was still looking at the door. "It says they reserve the right to refuse. That means they might also choose not to." That is an extremely optimistic reading of those 6 words. I prefer optimistic readings when pessimistic ones haven't been confirmed yet. James pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. He had known Bruce long enough to understand that arguing with him when he had that particular quality of stillness about him, that quiet, focused immovability, was roughly as productive as arguing with a wall that had studied philosophy. "If something happens in there," James said, "we don't fight, we don't argue, we walk away. Agreed?" Bruce looked at him then, and there was something in his expression that James would think about many times in the years that followed. It was not recklessness. It was not the bright, careless courage of someone who does not understand the risk. It was something more deliberate than that. It was the expression of a man who has considered the risk, weighed it, and decided that the thing on the other side of the risk is worth the cost of attempting it. "I won't start anything," Bruce said, "but I won't perform smallness either, James. Not for anyone." James Yim Lee looked at his friend for a long moment. Then he exhaled. Then he followed him through the door. The warmth hit them first. Then the smell, roasting meat, coffee, the faint sweetness of something baked. Then the silence. It arrived the way silence always arrives in those situations. Not all at once, but in a wave, table by table, conversation by conversation, until the only sound in the room was the low crackle of something cooking in the kitchen and the slow rotation of a ceiling fan overhead. Every face in the room was white. Every face in the room had turned. The man behind the counter had the build of someone who had spent decades doing physical work and had never entirely stopped. His name was Walter Kowalski. He was 51 years old, the son of a Polish butcher who had opened this restaurant in 1938 with 4 tables, 1 stove, and the unshakable conviction that hard work and the right neighborhood were all a man needed to build something that lasted. Walter had inherited the restaurant, the stove, replaced twice since then, and the conviction. He had also inherited certain ideas about how the world was ordered that he had never examined closely enough to question, because in his experience the world had never given him a strong enough reason to. He was wiping down the counter when the door opened. He registered the silence before he registered the cause of it. In 26 years of running this restaurant, Walter Kowalski had developed a sensitivity to the moods of a room the way a sailor develops sensitivity to weather, not through any particular intelligence, but through sheer accumulated exposure. And the mood of the room right now was telling him something he needed to pay attention to. He looked up. 2 Asian men stood just inside the door. The taller one, in the dark suit, was scanning the room with a calm, unhurried attention that Walter found immediately difficult to categorize. Most people who walked into a room they weren't sure of moved with some version of apology in their bodies. A slight rounding of the shoulders, a downward tilt of the chin, a readiness to shrink. This man had none of that. He stood the way a person stands when they have decided that the space they are occupying is theirs to occupy. Walter set down his cloth. He walked around the counter with the measured pace of a man who has handled difficult situations before and has learned that speed in these moments tends to make things worse. "Gentlemen," he said. His voice was not unkind, but it was firm in the way of a door that is closed but not yet locked. "I'm going to have to ask you to step back outside." The man in the suit looked at him with those steady, dark eyes. "We'd like a table for 2, he said. "We've been walking for some time and we're genuinely hungry." "I understand that," Walter said. "But this establishment serves a particular clientele. I think you can see that." "I can see the clientele," the man agreed pleasantly. "What I haven't seen is a reason." Walter blinked. In 26 years, no one had ever responded to that particular speech with that particular word. "A reason," Walter repeated. "Yes," the man said, with the patient tone of someone prepared to wait as long as necessary for an answer. "A reason. I'm curious what it is." Walter opened his mouth. Then, for just a fraction of a second, a fraction so small he would later convince himself it hadn't happened, he closed it again without speaking. Because in 26 years, no one had ever asked him that. And in the silence that followed the question, Walter Kowalski realized, with a discomfort he could not immediately name, that he did not have an answer ready. There is a particular kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something unresolved. That was the silence that filled Walter Kowalski's restaurant in that moment. Not hostile, not comfortable, but suspended, like a breath held collectively by every person in the room, waiting to see what would happen next. Walter recovered. He was not a man who stayed off balance for long. 26 years behind a counter had given him a practical fluency in confrontation. The drunk who wouldn't leave, the customer who disputed a bill, the supplier who shorted an order and denied it. He knew how to reassert control of a situation. He straightened his spine, squared his shoulders, and summoned the voice his father had used when a matter was settled and not open for further discussion. "The reason," Walter said, "is that this is my establishment. I built it, I run it, and I decide who sits at my tables." "That's fair," the man in the suit said immediately, and the speed of his agreement caught Walter off guard for the second time in under a minute. "It's absolutely your establishment. I respect that completely." A brief pause. "But owning something and having a reason for a decision about it are two different things. You have the right. I'm asking about the reason behind the right." From somewhere in the middle of the room, a chair scraped. A large man with a red face and a working man's hands. He came in every Thursday, always ordered the pot roast, always sat at the same table by the window, pushed back slightly from his seat, not standing, not yet. But repositioning, the way men do when they want to be ready, Walter noticed. The man in the suit noticed too, but his expression did not change. He did not look at the large man. He kept his eyes on Walter with a quality of focused attention that Walter was finding increasingly difficult to look away from. "My father built this place for his community," Walter said, and he was surprised to find that what came out was not the sharp dismissal he had intended, but something that sounded, even to his own ears, more like an explanation. "The people in this neighborhood, people who share certain things." "I understand that completely," the man said. "My teacher built his school the same way, for his community, for people who shared certain things." He tilted his head slightly. "What happens when the community gets larger than the building?" Walter stared at him. James Yim Lee, standing 2 steps behind his friend and slightly to the left, had stopped breathing. He had known Bruce Lee for 3 years. He had watched him dismantle opponents twice his size with an economy of movement that seemed almost unfair. But he had never seen him do what he was doing right now, dismantle a wall not with force but with questions, patient and precise as a man removing bricks one at a time, not to destroy the wall but to understand what it had been built to hold back. The large man by the window had not moved again. The room was still holding its breath. Walter Kowalski said nothing for a long moment. Then, without fully deciding to, he pulled 2 menus from the rack beside the counter. Pulling 2 menus from a rack is not a dramatic gesture. It takes less than 2 seconds. It makes almost no sound. And yet, in that room, at that moment, it landed with the quiet weight of something irreversible. The large man by the window, the Thursday regular, the pot roast, the repositioned chair, made a sound in his throat that was not quite a word. A woman at the table nearest the door gathered her purse slightly closer to her body. A teenage boy working the far tables froze mid-step with a plate in each hand, looking at Walter with the expression of someone waiting to be told what the rules were. Walter himself did not look at any of them. He set the menus on the nearest empty table, a table for 2 near the back, away from the window, away from the center of the room, and pulled out a chair with a deliberateness that said, "I have made a decision. I am not discussing it." Bruce Lee sat down. James Yim Lee sat down across from him, slowly, with the careful movements of a man lowering himself onto ice he is not entirely certain will hold. "Thank you," Bruce said to Walter, simply, without performance. Walter gave a single nod that committed to nothing and walked back behind his counter. What followed was not comfortable. Comfort was not available in that room that evening, and nobody pretended otherwise. The large man by the window ate the rest of his pot roast in a pointed silence that was meant to be noticed. 2 men at the counter paid their bills and left without finishing their coffee, moving with the stiff deliberateness of people making a statement through departure. A couple near the front exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation conducted without words. Bruce Lee watched none of this and noticed all of it. James kept his eyes on the menu, reading it with a concentration it did not merit. "You understand," he said quietly, "that we are the most visible people in this room despite being the smallest." "Visibility isn't always a disadvantage," Bruce said, scanning the menu with genuine interest. "In this context, in any context, when you are seen, you exist. When you are invisible, other people get to decide what you are." Bruce turned the menu over. "I refuse to be decided." James looked at him over the top of his menu. "That is either very wise or very dangerous." "Most wise things are," Bruce said. "The pot roast apparently comes with bread. I'm getting the pot roast." James stared at him for a moment. Then, despite everything, the tension in the room, the deliberate departures, the weight of a dozen hostile silences pressing from all directions, he laughed. A small laugh, quickly contained, but real. And in that small, real laugh, something in the room shifted. Not much, not enough to change anything significant, but enough that the air felt fractionally different, fractionally less like a held breath, and fractionally more like the slow, cautious beginning of an exhale. The boy who had frozen mid-step with 2 plates in his hands was named Danny Kowalski. He was 16 years old, Walter's son, and he had been working Friday and Saturday evenings at the restaurant since he was 12, first washing dishes, then buzzing tables, and for the past year serving. He knew the regulars by name, by order, and by mood. He knew which tables tipped and which ones didn't. He knew that the large man by the window always wanted his pot roast with extra gravy and never said thank you. And he knew that his father's word in this restaurant was the final word on every matter, without exception, without appeal. He had never seen his father seat someone like this before. Danny set the 2 plates down at their intended table, barely registering the thanks he received, and made his way back to the kitchen with the careful nonchalance of someone trying very hard not to appear to be thinking about something. In the kitchen, old Pete, the cook, a man of 60 with flour on his apron and opinions on everything, raised an eyebrow at him. "Your father just seated 2 Chinese fellas at table 9, Danny said. Pete turned from the stove. Did he? He did. Pete considered this for a moment with the philosophical equanimity of a man who has cooked in the same kitchen for 19 years and has learned that the dining room will always find new ways to surprise him. Then he turned back to the stove. "Well," he said, "they'll need menus." "They have menus." "Then they'll need food." Pete tapped the edge of his pan with a wooden spoon. "Go take their order, Danny." Danny stood in the kitchen doorway looking out at table 9. The man in the suit was talking to his companion in a low voice, relaxed, like 2 men sitting in a place they had every right to sit. The man in the suit had a quality about him that Danny could not immediately name, a combination of stillness and aliveness that seemed contradictory but somehow wasn't. He looked like someone who was completely aware of everything happening around him and had made a private decision not to be diminished by any of it. Danny had seen afraid before. He had seen brave before. This was neither of those things, or perhaps it was something that existed on the far side of both. He picked up his order pad and walked to table 9. "Good evening," he said, and was surprised by how steady his own voice came out. "Can I tell you about our specials?" The man in the suit looked up at him. The look was direct and warm and entirely without the faint condescension that Danny had learned, without ever being taught to expect from adults. It was the look of someone who considered a 16-year-old boy worth looking at properly. "Please," Bruce Lee said, "we'd like to hear everything." Danny told them about the specials, all of them, in more detail than he had ever provided to any customer before. And when he was done, he realized that for the past 3 minutes he had completely forgotten to be uncomfortable. Walter Kowalski had a habit, developed over decades, of watching his restaurant the way a chess player watches a board, not any single piece, but the whole arrangement, the relationships between pieces, the way movement in one corner created consequences in another. From behind his counter he could read the room the way other men read a newspaper, quickly, completely, and with a practiced understanding of what the information meant. What he was reading right now was confusing him. The 2 men at table 9 had ordered. Danny had taken their order without incident. Walter had watched that closely, and had returned to the kitchen with his pad and an expression that Walter could not immediately decode. The large man by the window had finished his pot roast and left, loudly enough in his departure to make his feelings clear, though not loudly enough to constitute a direct confrontation. 2 other tables had thinned, but the room had not emptied, and the people who remained had, in the almost imperceptible way of people trying not to appear to be doing something, redistributed their attention toward table 9. Walter was watching table 9 too. He could not entirely stop himself. The man in the suit, there was something about him. Walter had encountered confidence before in many forms. The confidence of money, which announced itself in clothing and carelessness. The confidence of size, which announced itself in how much space a body claimed. The confidence of anger, which announced itself in volume. This man had none of those. What he had was something Walter lacked the exact vocabulary for. a quality of being so completely settled inside himself that the hostility of the room seemed to pass around him rather than through him, the way water divides around a stone without moving the stone. It was making Walter uncomfortable in a way he could not justify to himself, which made him more uncomfortable still. He was still wrestling with this when the man stood up from table 9 and walked toward the counter. Not with the careful, conciliatory walk of someone approaching a situation they are unsure of, just walked, directly, naturally, the way a person walks towards something they have decided to walk toward. He stopped at the counter and looked at Walter with those steady eyes. "I want to apologize," the man said. Walter blinked. Of all the sentences he had been preparing himself to receive, that was not among them. "For what?" "For making your evening complicated. That wasn't my intention." A pause. "My name is Bruce Lee. I teach martial arts. I'm in Chicago for a demonstration tomorrow, and I came in tonight because the smell coming through your ventilation was genuinely extraordinary, and I was genuinely hungry." Another pause. Both of those things remained true. Walter looked at him for a long moment. "You're apologizing for coming into my restaurant." "I'm apologizing for the disruption, not for coming in." Bruce said it without aggression, without defiance, as a simple clarification of facts. "Those are different things." Walter set both hands flat on the counter. He had the sudden, strange sensation of being in an argument he hadn't started, about a position he hadn't fully chosen, with a man who wasn't arguing. "Why does it matter to you?" Walter asked. "You could have found somewhere else." Bruce considered the question with what appeared to be genuine seriousness. "Because somewhere else would have been easier," he said. "And I've learned that the things worth having are rarely found by always choosing the easier direction." Walter Kowalski had not sat down with a customer in 11 years. The last time had been with a supplier he suspected of fraud. A practical conversation, conducted across a table with a specific outcome in mind. He was not a man who confused the role of proprietor with the role of companion. The counter was his boundary. Behind it, he was in control. In front of it, the variables multiplied. He came out from behind it anyway. He did not fully understand why. He would think about that later, lying awake in the particular silence of a house where everyone else is sleeping, and he would not arrive at a clean answer. The closest he would come was this. The man had asked him a question 2 days ago. Not 2 days ago, 20 minutes ago, though it felt longer. A question about reasons, and Walter had not answered it. And something in him, some stubborn, unexamined part of him that had more integrity than he had perhaps given it credit for, had decided that the question deserved an answer. He pulled out the chair across from Bruce Lee and sat down. James Yim Lee, who had been quietly eating his food with the focused application of a man who has decided the best contribution he can make to a situation is to stay very still, looked up briefly, then looked back down at his plate. "My father came to this country from Krakow in 1921, Walter said. He did not frame it as the beginning of a story. It came out more like a fact being placed on the table for examination. He had nothing. He spoke almost no English. He found work in the stockyards because that was where they took men like him, men who were strong and willing and didn't need to be spoken to in a language anyone respected." A pause. "They called them things. The men in the stockyards. Names I won't repeat. They told them to go back where they came from. Told them they were taking jobs that belonged to real Americans." Bruce Lee listened without moving. "He built this place so his people had somewhere," Walter continued. "Somewhere the food was familiar. Somewhere nobody looked at you like you'd arrived uninvited to your own life." He stopped, looked at the table surface. "I know how that sounds, sitting here saying it to you." "It sounds like a man who loved his father," Bruce said, "and honoured what his father built." Walter looked up. "Don't make it more than it is." "I'm not. I mean it plainly." Bruce turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "My teacher, Ip Man, built his school in Hong Kong for the same reason. A place where his people could belong to something, where the art he carried could survive." A pause. "He also taught me that the purpose of a container is to hold something precious long enough for it to grow strong enough to exist without the container." Walter was quiet for a moment. "Meaning what, exactly?" Meaning that your father's restaurant was never really about the walls, Bruce said. It was about what the walls were protecting, and sometimes what was being protected grows strong enough that the walls become the smaller part of the story. The kitchen had gone quiet. Through the serving window, Pete the cook stood motionless at his stove, not pretending otherwise. Walter Kowalski looked at the man across the table from him, this young man in a suit that had cost him too much, with eyes that listened as precisely as most people only managed to speak, and felt something shift in his chest, not breaking, not surrendering, something more like the feeling of a knot releasing that you had held so long you had stopped noticing the tension. "You said you teach martial arts," Walter said finally. "I do." "And that's enough to walk into a room like this one and just—" He gestured at the air between them. "Just sit." Bruce smiled then. It was a real smile, unhurried and complete. "It took 11 years of training to learn how to just sit," he said. Nothing about it was easy. The restaurant emptied slowly, the way restaurants empty at the end of a long evening, not all at once, but in a gradual diminishing, table by table, until the hum of occupied space gives way to the particular quiet of a room returning to itself. By 9 o'clock, only a handful of customers remained, and none of them showed any urgency to leave. Something had changed in the quality of the air, not resolved, not concluded, but different from what it had been 2 hours earlier. Less like a held breath, more like the first careful exchange between two people who have decided, cautiously, to try speaking honestly. Danny Kowalski had refilled the coffee cups at table 9 3 times. He told himself it was attentiveness. It was not entirely attentiveness. He had been listening, not with his whole body turned toward the conversation, he was not so obvious as that, but with the particular sideways attention of a teenage boy who understands that something important is happening and has the intelligence to know he should pay attention, even if he cannot yet fully understand why. He had heard the word Krakow. He had heard the word container. He had heard his father say things he had never heard his father say out loud before, in a voice that was different from his father's usual voice. Quieter, more careful, like a man handling something he was not certain of the weight of. And he had watched Bruce Lee listen to his father the way, Danny struggled for the comparison and finally found it, the way a good teacher listens to a student who is working something out, not waiting for a pause to insert a conclusion, actually listening, as if what his father was saying mattered independently of whether it was convenient or comfortable or easy to hear. At 9:15, Bruce Lee stood to leave. He shook Walter's hand, a firm handshake, direct, no performance in it, and said something quietly that Danny, clearing a table nearby, caught only partially. Something about the food being worth every moment of the evening. Something about a man who builds something with his hands, understanding more about foundations than most people who only ever inherit them. Walter walked them to the door. It was something he did for almost nobody. On the threshold, Bruce paused and turned back. "Your son," he said to Walter, nodding toward Danny. "He explained your entire menu with genuine enthusiasm. That's not a small thing. That means he cares about what this place is." Walter looked at Danny with an expression Danny had no existing category for. It was not his father's approval face, which Danny knew well. It was something less practiced than that, something that had arrived without being summoned. "He does," Walter said, and the simplicity of it, 3 words, no qualification, no condition, landed on Danny somewhere in the region of the sternum and stayed there. Bruce Lee nodded once. Then he and James Yim Lee walked out into the Chicago night, and the door closed behind them with the small, ordinary sound of a latch finding its place. Walter stood at the door for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the glass, at the dark street beyond it, at the card in the lower corner of the window that said, "We reserve the right to refuse service in handwriting," that had been his father's before it was his. He did not remove it that night. But he looked at it differently. There are stories that end with a gesture grand enough to be photographed, documented, and repeated in history books. A speech from a steps, a signature on a document, a moment so deliberately conclusive that its meaning requires no interpretation. This was not that kind of story. The card came down from the window of Kowalski's restaurant on a Tuesday morning in October, 1964, Approximately 6 weeks after the evening Bruce Lee and James Yim Lee had walked through its door, Walter removed it himself early before the first customers arrived, with no announcement and no ceremony. He folded it once and put it in the same drawer where he kept his father's original menu, the handwritten one from 1938, stained with grease and decades of handling, not destroyed, but set aside, preserved with the complicated respect one gives to things that were once necessary and are necessary no longer. He never spoke publicly about why. When regular customers noticed the card's absence and asked, Walter said only that it had been there long enough, which was true, which was also in the way of true things that contain more than they express, not the whole truth. The whole truth was a conversation at a corner table on a Friday evening in spring, with a young man in a suit and a question about reasons that Walter had not been able to answer to his own satisfaction. The whole truth was the slow, uncomfortable work of sitting with that unsatisfied answer for 6 weeks until it became something he could no longer comfortably ignore. Danny Kowalski went on to study at the University of Illinois. He majored in philosophy, which his father regarded with a mixture of bewilderment and pride that he never entirely resolved into one or the other. In his first year, in an introductory ethics course, his professor asked the class to describe a moment when they had witnessed someone change their mind about something important without being forced to. Danny wrote about a Friday evening in his father's restaurant. He received the highest mark in the class. His professor wrote in the margin, "The most compelling examples are always the ones the writer witnessed themselves." James Yim Lee told the story of that evening occasionally, in later years, to students at the Oakland school he and Bruce had built together. He never told it as a triumph. He told it the way you tell a story about watching someone walk a narrow path over difficult ground. With admiration, yes, but also with the particular respect of someone who understood exactly how narrow the path had been, and how easily it could have gone another way. Bruce Lee never spoke about it publicly. This was consistent with his nature. He was not interested in his own legend. He was interested in the next question, the next conversation, the next door that looked closed, until you walked up to it and asked, clearly and without aggression, what exactly it was protecting and whether that thing still needed protecting in the way it was being protected. He gave a successful demonstration the following morning. The promoter signed the tour. Bruce Lee continued west, then east, then everywhere, carrying with him the philosophy he had been building since he was 13 years old, that the greatest battles are not fought with fists, that the hardest walls to move are the ones people have stopped questioning, and that a man who walks into a room and refuses to be made small by it is practicing, whether he knows it or not, the highest form of the art. Walter Kowalski's restaurant stayed open until 1987, when Walter retired at the age of 74 and sold the building to a young couple who turned it into a bakery. By then, it had served, without distinction or condition, every kind of person the neighborhood had to offer for over 2 decades. On his last day, Walter took his father's original menu from the drawer and held it for a long time. Then he took the folded card from beside it. We reserve the right to refuse service, and held that too. He put the menu in a box to keep. He put the card in the trash, not because the history it represented was worthless, but because the man he had become no longer needed it to know who he was. That is what Bruce Lee did when he walked into that restaurant. He did not argue, he did not demand, he did not perform outrage or lecture or shame. He sat down, ordered the pot roast, and asked a question that a man spent 6 weeks answering honestly to himself. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything.